The old golden retriever had been silent for almost 3 months at the shelter, but the second Claire Bennett walked past his kennel, he slammed his frail body against the metal gate so hard that the entire hallway froze. The sharp crash echoed through the building, startling 2 volunteers nearby as the elderly dog let out a deep, trembling cry that sounded less like barking and more like panic. Claire stopped mid-step, her hand tightening around the strap of her purse while every dog in the shelter suddenly erupted into noise around her except him. The old retriever just stood there staring directly into her eyes, shaking so violently that one of the workers rushed forward in alarm. "Rusty never does that," the woman whispered nervously. "Actually, he barely moves at all anymore." Claire swallowed hard and glanced back toward the front office, already regretting coming there in the first place. She had only stopped at the shelter because she couldn't stand going home to an empty apartment again. 3 months earlier, her mother had passed away unexpectedly, and ever since the funeral, silence had become unbearable. Her friends kept telling her to get out more, to try something new, to stop sitting alone every night with old photo albums and cold takeout containers scattered across the kitchen counter. But standing inside the shelter now, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the smell of disinfectant hanging in the air, Claire suddenly felt like she'd made a mistake. Rusty's cloudy brown eyes never left her face. The old dog slowly approached the kennel gate again, this time quieter, almost cautious, like he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. Claire noticed patches of gray around his muzzle and the stiffness in his back legs. He looked exhausted, forgotten, but there was something else too, something that made the hairs rise on the back of her neck. Recognition. The shelter worker gave an awkward laugh. "This is honestly creeping me out a little," she admitted. "He's been returned 3 times this year. He doesn't bond with people anymore. Most days he just sleeps facing the wall." Claire crouched carefully a few feet away from the kennel, unsure why her chest suddenly felt tight. Rusty let out another soft cry and pressed himself against the bars, his tail thumping weakly against the concrete floor. Then he did something that made Claire's stomach drop. The old dog slowly lifted one paw and scratched twice against the bottom of the metal door. Scratch, scratch. Claire's face went pale instantly, because she knew that sound. When she was little, there had been a dog who scratched on her bedroom door exactly the same way every single night during thunderstorms. The memory hit her so suddenly that she stood back up in shock. No, that was impossible. Claire forced out a nervous smile and stepped away from the kennel, trying to calm the strange feeling building inside her chest. But the moment she turned toward the exit, Rusty began crying again, louder this time, desperate enough that people in the lobby started looking over. Claire stopped near the door as the old retriever stared at her with terrified eyes, and just before the shelter worker reached to calm him down, the dog let out one broken whine and collapsed directly against the gate like he was terrified of losing her all over again. Claire should have walked out the moment the old dog collapsed against the kennel gate, but something about the fear in Rusty's eyes rooted her to the shelter floor. The volunteers quickly opened the enclosure, worried he might have hurt himself, yet the second the gate swung open, the exhausted retriever ignored everyone else completely and dragged his stiff body straight toward Claire. His paws slipped slightly on the polished concrete as he moved, and for a second she thought he might fall again. But he kept going until his head pressed weakly against her knee. The entire hallway went quiet. One of the workers stared in disbelief. "I have never seen him choose somebody before," she said softly. Claire looked down at the dog trembling beside her and finally noticed how thin he really was beneath his faded golden fur. His ribs showed slightly through his coat, and one of his ears carried an old scar hidden under silver hair. Up close, he smelled faintly like shampoo and medicine. Not dirty. Not neglected, just old, painfully old. Claire slowly sat down on the floor without even thinking about it, and Rusty immediately lowered himself beside her with a tired sigh that sounded almost human. He kept one paw touching her shoe the entire time, as if he needed to make sure she was still there. The shelter manager eventually joined them and explained that Rusty had arrived nearly 6 months earlier after his previous owner passed away. Nobody knew much about his earlier life because the paperwork had been incomplete, but the manager admitted there was something unusual about him from the beginning. Most senior dogs eventually adjusted to shelter life, even if they became quiet or withdrawn. Rusty had done the opposite. Every single day, he waited beside the front hallway at exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, staring at the entrance doors for hours without moving. At first, the staff assumed he expected his owner to return. But even after months passed, the behavior never stopped. It was like he was waiting for somebody specific, the manager murmured. Claire listened quietly while absent-mindedly stroking the old retriever's fur. Rusty closed his eyes the second her hand touched the top of his head. The tension slowly left his body little by little, and for the first time since she had arrived, he looked peaceful. One volunteer crouched nearby and smiled sadly. He barely eats some days, she admitted. But this morning he finished breakfast for the first time in over a week. Claire felt a strange ache in her chest. She understood loneliness more than she wanted to admit. Since her mother's death, her apartment had become painfully silent at night. Sometimes she left the television running just to hear another voice in the room. Looking at Rusty now, curled beside her with tired eyes and trembling breaths, she suddenly recognized the same emptiness inside him. Neither of them seemed to know what to do with the silence anymore. The manager carefully handed Claire a faded intake folder with Rusty's medical notes clipped inside. Arthritis, reduced hearing, anxiety, trouble sleeping. But one line near the bottom caught her attention immediately. Severe distress during thunderstorms. Claire's fingers froze on the paper. Outside the shelter windows, dark clouds had already started gathering over the parking lot. A low rumble echoed faintly in the distance, and almost instantly Rusty lifted his head from her lap and stared directly toward the ceiling with terrified eyes, as if he already knew exactly what was coming. The first crack of thunder rolled across the sky, just as Claire signed the temporary foster papers, and the reaction it triggered in Rusty made the entire shelter office tense instantly. The old retriever jerked upright so fast that his chair scraped across the tile floor, his breathing suddenly sharp and uneven. Claire expected him to panic the way frightened dogs usually did during storms, maybe hide beneath a desk or press himself against a wall, but instead Rusty began pacing in tight, frantic circles around her legs. Not random circles, deliberate ones. Every few seconds, he stopped directly in front of Claire as if trying to block her from moving, then nudged her hard toward the hallway leading deeper into the building. "What is he doing?" one volunteer asked nervously as Rusty suddenly spun back toward the front lobby windows. Rain had started hammering the glass outside, and another flash of lightning briefly illuminated the parking lot. Rusty let out a low sound deep in his throat and rushed toward the entrance doors. Claire barely managed to grab his leash before he pulled himself free completely. The old dog was surprisingly strong for his age. He planted all four paws against the floor and refused to move away from the doors, staring through the glass with frantic focus. The shelter manager frowned. "This is strange," she admitted quietly. "Usually he hides during storms." Rusty began scratching at the floor near the entrance in rapid, desperate motions, his nails clicking sharply against the tile. Then he suddenly stopped and pressed his nose against the very bottom corner of the glass door. Claire followed his gaze outside, but saw nothing except rainwater rushing across the parking lot beneath the flickering streetlights. "Maybe he hears something," one of the workers whispered. But Rusty was not acting like a dog listening for noise. He was acting like he expected someone to arrive. Another thunderclap exploded overhead, and the old retriever startled violently before rushing back toward Claire again. This time he grabbed the sleeve of her coat gently between his teeth and tugged hard toward the hallway. Claire's pulse quickened. "Rusty," she said softly, trying to calm him, but the dog ignored her completely. He led her halfway down the corridor before abruptly stopping outside a storage room near the back of the shelter. The moment Claire reached for the doorknob, Rusty released her sleeve and sat down directly in front of the door, trembling uncontrollably. The shelter manager looked confused. "There is nothing in there except old donation boxes." Claire slowly opened the room anyway. Dusty shelves lined the walls beside stacked blankets and plastic containers filled with dog toys. Nothing unusual. Nothing dangerous. Yet Rusty refused to step inside. He simply stared into the room while whining softly under his breath. Claire crouched beside him again, unsettled by the intensity of his behavior. "It is okay," she whispered. But the old retriever suddenly backed away from the doorway and began pacing again, more agitated than before. He kept glancing between Claire and the storage room as if he desperately wanted her to notice something she could not see. Then without warning, Rusty rushed past everyone in the hallway and disappeared around the corner toward the kennel area. A volunteer hurried after him, while Claire followed close behind. They found the old retriever standing inside the empty kennel he had occupied for months, staring at the concrete wall near the floor. At first, Claire thought he was frozen in fear again. Then Rusty slowly lifted one paw and began clawing at the exact same spot over and over with frantic urgency, until small flakes of paint started falling away from the wall, revealing something hidden underneath. The tiny flakes of paint continued falling onto the kennel floor as Rusty clawed desperately at the wall, and within seconds the shelter staff began pulling Claire backward in alarm. "Okay, that is enough," one volunteer snapped nervously while another hurried to grab the leash. Rusty had never acted this aggressively inside the shelter before, and the panic spreading through the room became impossible to ignore. The old retriever did not growl or bare his teeth, but his behavior felt strangely obsessive now, almost frantic. Claire watched helplessly as two workers tried guiding him away from the wall, yet the moment they pulled him back, Rusty twisted free and lunged toward the exact same spot again. His tired body slammed awkwardly against the kennel divider as he scratched at the peeling paint with renewed urgency. "He is hurting himself," the manager said sharply. "This is not normal." Claire's stomach tightened. Just an hour earlier, the old dog had seemed heartbreakingly gentle, but now everyone around her looked genuinely unsettled. Another loud thunderclap rattled the building overhead, and Rusty suddenly froze in place. His ears lifted. Then he turned and stared directly at Claire again with a look so intense that it made her pulse quicken. For one strange moment, she almost felt guilty, as though she was failing to understand something important. But before she could move closer, Rusty bolted past the workers again and raced toward the hallway exit leading to the back offices. "Stop him," someone shouted. The old retriever slipped badly on the floor while trying to turn the corner, nearly collapsing before catching himself. Claire hurried after him, but the shelter manager stepped directly into her path. "Claire, wait." Her voice had changed now, quieter and more serious. "You need to understand something. This exact behavior is why the last family brought him back." Claire blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" The manager hesitated before answering. "They said he became fixated on certain rooms in the house. He would scratch at walls for hours and panic whenever storms rolled in. Eventually, their kids became afraid of him." Claire looked down the hallway, where Rusty stood trembling near the office doors. The old dog no longer looked confused or frightened. He looked desperate. One volunteer lowered her voice nervously. "What if he has canine cognitive issues? Sometimes older dogs develop strange compulsive behaviors." Another worker nodded uneasily. "Or trauma responses." Claire hated hearing them talk about him that way while he stood only a few feet away, exhausted and shaking. Rusty slowly approached her again, but this time the shelter staff instinctively moved between them. The shift in atmosphere hurt more than Claire expected. Only minutes earlier, everyone had pitted the lonely old retriever. Now they were studying him cautiously, watching every movement like he might suddenly become unpredictable. Rusty stopped walking the moment the manager blocked his path. The old dog lowered his head slightly and let out one quiet whine that sounded painfully defeated. Claire felt her chest ache. "He is scared," she said softly. "That is all." But even as she spoke, Rusty abruptly turned back toward the kennel hallway again and began clawing wildly at the floor this time, circling the same area over and over until his breathing became ragged. The workers exchanged worried glances. One finally sighed and shook her head. "I do not think sending him home tonight is a good idea anymore." Claire's heart dropped instantly. The manager nodded reluctantly before looking toward the back offices. "Call Dr. Moreno," she said quietly. "If this behavior keeps escalating, we may need to sedate him before somebody gets hurt." Claire watched helplessly as one of the volunteers disappeared into the back office to call the veterinarian, while Rusty remained crouched low against the floor near the hallway wall, breathing hard from exhaustion. The storm outside had intensified now, rain rattling violently against the shelter windows while occasional flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the building in cold white bursts. The old retriever looked completely drained, yet every few seconds his eyes darted back toward the kennel area again like he was terrified of running out of time. Claire could not shake the feeling that everyone was missing something important. "Please do not sedate him yet," she said quietly. He is trying to show us something. The shelter manager sighed sympathetically, but shook her head. Claire, I understand. You feel attached to him already, but this kind of fixation can become dangerous in older dogs, especially during storms. Before Claire could answer, Rusty suddenly struggled back onto his feet again. One volunteer immediately tightened her grip on the leash, expecting another frantic outburst, but instead the old dog did something strangely calm. He walked slowly back toward the kennel corridor without pulling once. His stiff legs trembled with each step, and for a moment Claire thought he was finally giving up. But when Rusty reached the kennel where he had scratched at the wall earlier, he stopped directly beside the chipped patch of paint and sat down silently. No barking, no scratching, just staring. The hallway fell quiet again. Claire stepped closer this time, despite the nervous looks from the staff. Under the peeling paint near the bottom of the wall, something faintly metallic reflected in the overhead light. At first it looked like nothing more than an old screw buried beneath layers of repainting, but Claire crouched lower and noticed a tiny edge sticking out from behind the cracked drywall paper. Rusty's ears lifted immediately the moment she reached toward it. Wait, the shelter manager said cautiously, but Claire had already slid her fingernail beneath the loose edge. A small folded object slipped free from the wall cavity and landed softly against the concrete floor. Everyone stared. It was not trash. It was an old photograph sealed inside a clear plastic sleeve yellowed with age. Claire carefully unfolded it while Rusty remained perfectly still beside her, watching every movement. The picture had been damaged by moisture over the years, but the image was still visible enough to make the room go silent. A little girl stood smiling beside a golden retriever in front of a white suburban house decorated with Christmas lights. The dog in the photograph wore a dark plaid bandana around its neck. Claire's breath caught painfully in her throat because Rusty still wore the exact same faded bandana now, barely visible beneath the silver fur around his chest. That cannot be, one volunteer whispered. Claire turned the photograph over slowly. Written across the back in faded blue ink were 4 words, waiting for Claire. Be good. Her stomach twisted instantly. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The shelter manager looked visibly unsettled now, glancing between the photograph and the exhausted retriever sitting quietly beside Claire's knee. Where did that come from? Another worker asked under her breath. Claire barely heard them anymore. Her eyes remained locked on the little girl in the picture. Something about the child's face felt disturbingly familiar, though the image was too faded to fully recognize. Beside her, Rusty slowly lowered his head onto Claire's shoe again with a weak, exhausted sigh, almost as if he finally believed she understood part of what he had been trying to say all along. The shelter manager stared at the hidden photograph one last time before making a decision. Do not call the veterinarian yet, she said quietly. Then she looked directly at Claire. I think we need to find out who hid this inside the wall. The storm continued raging outside as Claire sat frozen on the kennel floor with the faded photograph trembling slightly in her hands. Rusty stayed pressed quietly against her leg now, no longer frantic, no longer scratching or pacing like before. It was almost as if finding the hidden picture had calmed him. The shelter staff exchanged uneasy glances while the manager carefully crouched beside the damaged wall to inspect the opening Rusty had uncovered. There is more space back there, she murmured. One of the volunteers fetched a flashlight from the office, and within seconds the narrow cavity behind the drywall became visible. At first it looked empty except for insulation and dust, but then the beam of light caught the corner of a small metal box wedged deep inside the wall itself. Claire's heartbeat quickened immediately. The manager carefully reached in and pulled the box free. Rusty slowly lifted his head the second it touched the floor. The old retriever stared at it so intensely that nobody in the hallway moved. The box was old and heavily scratched, no larger than a shoebox, with faded cartoon stickers peeling off the sides. Claire suddenly felt dizzy before she even opened it, because she recognized those stickers. Tiny yellow stars, a smiling moon, a crooked purple dolphin near the corner. Her hands began shaking uncontrollably. No, she whispered under her breath. The shelter manager carefully opened the lid, and the smell of old paper immediately filled the hallway. Inside sat dozens of weathered childhood items sealed in plastic bags to protect them from moisture. Crayon drawings, friendship bracelets, a small stuffed rabbit missing one button eye, and resting carefully on top of everything else was a folded sheet of notebook paper covered in large, uneven handwriting. Claire stared at the writing and instantly stopped breathing. It was hers. The letter had obviously been written by a child many years ago. "Buddy," it read in faded pencil. "If you get scared during storms, come hide with me behind the wall, because nobody else knows about our secret spot." Claire's vision blurred instantly. The entire hallway fell silent except for rain pounding against the windows outside. Suddenly, the memory crashed back into her, so hard it almost knocked the air from her lungs. She was 8 years old again, sitting inside the old laundry room wall compartment in her childhood house during thunderstorms, because loud storms terrified both her and her dog. Buddy used to crawl inside beside her while she read stories aloud with a flashlight until the storm passed. Claire pressed one trembling hand over her mouth as another memory surfaced immediately after it. The house in the photograph. The hidden compartment. The scratching at walls during storms. Rusty had not been acting irrationally at all. He had been trying to lead her to the exact place where he believed they used to hide together. The shelter manager looked stunned. "Claire," she whispered carefully. "This building used to be a private home before it became a shelter 20 years ago." Claire slowly turned toward Rusty, her pulse roaring in her ears now. The old retriever gazed back at her quietly, his tired eyes filled with something far deeper than fear. Recognition, loyalty, memory. Every strange thing suddenly made horrifying sense. The waiting by the front doors every afternoon. The scratching at hidden spaces during storms. The panic whenever she tried leaving. Rusty had not recognized the shelter. He had recognized her. Claire's chest tightened painfully as tears filled her eyes. All this time the old dog had not been confused or dangerous or unstable. He had spent months desperately trying to bring her back to the place where they once hid together as children, because somewhere inside his aging mind, he still believed she would remember him there. Claire stared at the exhausted retriever in complete shock while the truth settled over the room like thunder itself. And for the first time that night, she realized the one creature everyone thought had lost his mind had actually been the only one who understood exactly what was happening all along. Claire could not stop staring at Rusty after the truth settled over the shelter hallway. The old retriever remained curled quietly beside her feet, exhausted from everything he had done to make her remember, while guilt spread through her chest so painfully that she could barely breathe. Every frightened movement he made earlier suddenly replayed inside her mind differently now. The scratching at the wall had not been destruction. The pacing had not been confusion. Even his desperate panic at the front entrance made sense now. He had been trying to guide her back to a memory that mattered to both of them before it was too late. Claire slowly lowered herself onto the kennel floor beside him again, clutching the faded childhood photograph tightly in her trembling hands. "You remembered me," she whispered hoarsely. Rusty immediately lifted his head at the sound of her voice. His cloudy eyes softened, and for the first time since she had arrived, the old dog's body seemed to relax completely. Claire felt tears spill down her face before she even realized she was crying. Not loud sobbing, not dramatic grief, just silent tears falling one after another as years of forgotten memories slowly came flooding back. She remembered sneaking peanut butter crackers to Buddy under the kitchen table when her parents argued late at night. She remembered sleeping beside him on the laundry room floor. After nightmares because he always pressed against her chest until she calmed down. Most painfully of all, she remembered the storm. Claire had been 8 years old the last time she saw him. One terrible thunderstorm had knocked out power across the neighborhood, and during the confusion Buddy disappeared. Her father spent days searching nearby streets before finally telling her the dog was probably gone forever. Claire remembered sitting on her childhood bed, crying herself sick, while clutching Buddy's old leash against her chest. Over time, the memories faded beneath school, adulthood, work, loss, and years of pretending painful things did not hurt anymore. But Buddy had never forgotten. The realization shattered something inside her. While she moved on with her life, the dog who once hid beside her during storms had somehow spent years carrying those memories alone. The shelter staff stood quietly nearby now, visibly emotional themselves. One volunteer wiped her eyes while watching Rusty carefully rest his head against Claire's lap again. "We thought he was deteriorating," she admitted softly. All this time he was trying to communicate. Claire looked down at the old retriever in disbelief. Rusty's breathing had finally slowed. though every thunderclap outside still made his ears twitch anxiously. Without thinking, Claire gently wrapped both arms around him. The old dog immediately leaned his full weight against her chest with a deep, exhausted sigh that sounded almost relieved. It was not excitement. It was release. Like he had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and could finally put it down. Claire buried her face against his silver fur and realized something even more heartbreaking. Rusty had probably recognized her the instant she walked into the shelter. Even after decades. Even with age clouding his eyes and weakening his body. He had known her immediately, and she had almost let them sedate him because she thought he was broken. The guilt hit so hard that Claire physically flinched. She pulled back suddenly and looked toward the shelter manager with tears still running down her face. "You cannot leave him here," she said firmly. "Not after this." The manager hesitated carefully. "Claire, senior dogs like Rusty require constant care, medication, monitoring. It is not an easy responsibility." Claire looked down at the exhausted retriever trembling quietly beside her and made her decision without another second of hesitation. "Then I am taking him home tonight," she said. "And this time, I am not losing him again." The storm finally began weakening just after midnight as Claire carefully carried the old memory box through the front door of her apartment, with Rusty slowly following behind her. The exhausted retriever paused inside the entryway immediately, his cloudy eyes scanning the unfamiliar room while rainwater dripped softly from his fur onto the hardwood floor. Claire expected him to look nervous in a new environment after everything he had been through. But instead he seemed strangely calm now, almost thoughtful, as if he was searching for something he had not seen in many years. Claire quietly closed the apartment door behind them and looked around at the silent living room she had dreaded returning to every night since her mother died. For months the place had felt cold no matter how many lights she turned on. But tonight something was different. Rusty slowly wandered through the apartment without pulling on his leash or pacing anxiously. He moved carefully from room to room, sniffing corners and furniture with quiet concentration, while Claire unpacked the old childhood items from the shelter box onto the coffee table. Every object carried pieces of a life she thought she had forgotten forever. The stuffed rabbit, the friendship bracelets, the faded flashlight she used during thunderstorms. Claire smiled weakly through tired tears as she carefully placed each item down one at a time. Then she noticed Rusty standing motionless near the hallway closet. His tail was wagging slowly. Claire walked over and opened the closet door curiously. Stacked behind several winter coats sat an old plastic storage container she had not touched since moving into the apartment years earlier. She had completely forgotten it existed. Rusty let out a soft breath and sat down beside it immediately. Claire's chest tightened as she pulled the dusty container into the living room and opened the lid. Inside were dozens of forgotten things from her childhood home after it had been sold long ago. Old schoolbooks, family photographs, a broken snow globe, and buried near the bottom beneath folded blankets was a tiny red cassette player with faded stickers across the front. Claire stared at it in shock. Her mother used to record bedtime stories on tapes for her when she was little because thunderstorms terrified her so badly she could not sleep. Buddy always curled beside her while those recordings played through the night. Claire slowly pressed the power button, surprised when the old machine crackled weakly to life. Static filled the apartment for several seconds before a warm, familiar voice suddenly echoed softly through the room. Her mother's voice. "Hi, sweetheart." The recording whispered gently. "If the storm is loud tonight, remember you are safe. Buddy is right beside you." Claire covered her mouth instantly as emotion overwhelmed her all over again. Beside her, Rusty slowly lowered himself onto the rug and rested his tired head near the cassette player the moment the voice began speaking. His entire body relaxed in a way she had not seen before. No trembling, no panic, no pacing. The old retriever simply listened quietly with his eyes half closed while thunder rumbled faintly outside in the distance. Claire sat beside him on the floor for nearly an hour while the old recordings played one after another through the apartment. Childhood laughter, bedtime stories, rainstorms from long ago captured softly in the background. And through every tape, Buddy's collar tags jingled faintly somewhere nearby, beside her younger voice. Rusty never moved away from the sound once. Eventually, Claire noticed his breathing had become slow and steady for the first time all night. She gently placed one of the old blankets over his tired body before reaching down to stroke the silver fur around his ears. Rusty opened his eyes briefly and looked up at her with complete peace in his expression now. Not fear, not desperation, just trust. Then for the first time since Claire had walked into the shelter, the old retriever finally fell into a deep, peaceful sleep without waking at the sound of thunder. Over the next several weeks, the apartment slowly transformed into something neither Claire nor Rusty had felt in years. Home no longer sounded empty. Every morning, the old retriever waited patiently beside the kitchen window while Claire made coffee, his silver muzzle resting against the cabinet as sunlight spilled across the floorboards. He still walked slowly because of his arthritis, and storms still made him uneasy sometimes. But now, whenever thunder rolled in the distance, he no longer paced in panic searching for hidden places behind walls. Instead, he quietly carried the old red cassette player toward Claire with gentle care and waited beside her until she pressed play. Somehow, after all those years apart, the sound of her mother's voice still calmed him. Claire began noticing little things about herself changing too. For the first time since her mother passed away, she stopped sleeping with the television running at night. She stopped avoiding old photographs. She even started opening the curtains again in the mornings instead of leaving the apartment dim and silent all day. Rusty had not simply returned memories to her. He had returned pieces of herself she thought grief had erased forever. One Saturday afternoon, Claire drove back to the old shelter carrying several framed photographs and the weathered memory box they had found hidden behind the wall. The staff gathered quietly around her as she showed them childhood pictures of Buddy from decades earlier. The shelter manager wiped tears from her eyes when Claire explained that the old private home converted into the shelter had once belonged to her grandparents long before the property changed ownership. Somehow, after becoming lost during that storm all those years ago, Buddy had eventually found his way back to the one place where he remembered feeling safe. And when the house later became a shelter, he had remained there through every owner, every passing year, still carrying the memory of the frightened little girl who used to hide beside him during thunderstorms. Nobody in the room could fully explain how he ended up back there after so much time. But Claire no longer needed every answer. Some things mattered more than logic. Before leaving, Claire carefully hung the faded photograph from inside the wall near the shelter entrance so future visitors could see it. Underneath the frame, she placed a small handwritten note that simply read, "Sometimes the ones waiting the longest are the ones who loved us first." The shelter volunteers stood silently for several moments after reading it. Rusty became something special at the shelter after that. Staff members often shared his story with nervous adopters considering older dogs no one else wanted. Donations increased. Senior adoptions increased too. People who once walked past gray muzzles and slow steps began stopping to look a little longer. Claire noticed that every time she brought Rusty back to visit, the old retriever always paused beside the hallway wall where he had hidden the memory box years earlier. But he never scratched at it again. He would simply sit there peacefully for a moment before returning to Claire's side like he finally understood his job was done. One cold evening near the start of winter, Claire sat beside the apartment window watching snow drift quietly past the glass while Rusty slept with his head resting against her feet. The old cassette player hummed softly nearby, filling the room with faint childhood laughter recorded decades ago. Claire looked down at the aging dog whose loyalty had survived storms, loneliness, time, and years of silence just to find her one last time. Then she reached down gently and rested her hand against his tired silver fur as tears quietly filled her eyes again. Some hearts never stop waiting for the people they already chose long ago.